I never thought I and Oppos D end up harvesting a row of maple trees just to make a point. But when your HOA decides your property line is more of a suggestion than an actual legal boundary, strange things start happening. A few years ago, I was living on a small piece of land just outside a growing subdivision in western Indiana. I and Oppos. I'm going to change a few names here because some of the people involved still live there, but the facts are exactly how they happened. My property sat right at the edge of a neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Estates. The subdivision had been built about a decade earlier on what used to be farmland. Before the developers showed up with bulldozers, decorative stone entrances, and brochures full of smiling families walking golden retrievers, that entire area had been fields, barns, and gravel roads. My place was one of the few original properties left standing. I liked it that way. I wasn't Oppos, T anti-neighbor. I wasn't Oppos, T anti-community. I just enjoyed having a little space. The back portion of my land was mostly open pasture. Nothing fancy, just grass, a few mature trees, equipment access paths, and enough room to move trailers around when I needed to. Most importantly, every inch of it was clearly surveyed. The county records showed it. The steel markers showed it. The fence line showed it. You and Oppos D have to work pretty hard to accidentally mistake where my property ended, which is why what happened next felt less like an accident and more like somebody making a decision they assumed I would and Oppos T challenge. One Saturday morning in early spring, I was driving my utility vehicle along the back pasture checking fence posts after a storm. That and Oppos S when I saw them. A row of freshly planted maple saplings. About 15 of them. Neatly spaced. Wooden support stakes. Protective irrigation bags. Fresh mulch around each trunk. The whole thing looked professionally organized. At first I honestly laughed. I figured somebody from the neighborhood landscaping committee must have gotten confused. Maybe they thought the fence line was somewhere else. Maybe they planted on the wrong side of a marker. Mistakes happen. No big deal. Or at least that and Oppos. That's what I thought. 3 days later, I opened my mailbox and found the neighborhood newsletter. The headline immediately caught my eye. End quote. Community Shade Initiative successfully completed. End quote. Now that sounded suspiciously familiar. I sat down at the kitchen table and started reading. According to the article, volunteers from Cedar Ridge Estates had spent an entire weekend planting dozens of maple trees along a walking trail behind the subdivision. The newsletter praised the project. The board praised the volunteers. The volunteers praised themselves. Everybody seemed very pleased. There was just one tiny detail. The walking trail they described wasn't Oppos T theirs. It ran along the edge of my property. And those trees? Those trees were sitting several feet inside my land. I remember staring at the newsletter and thinking, end quote, no way, end quote. Surely somebody on the board knew where the boundary was. Surely somebody checked. Surely nobody would spend money on a landscaping project without confirming ownership first. Then again, I and Oppos VE met HOA boards before. That afternoon, I grabbed my survey documents and headed out to the pasture. I checked every marker. Twice. Then I checked them again. The answer never changed. Every single tree was on my side. Not close to the line. Not touching the line. Not arguably near the line. On my land. Completely. Unequivocally. At that point, I still wasn't Oppos T angry. Honestly, I was more confused than anything. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I sent an email. I attached copies of the county survey. I highlighted the relevant boundary measurements. I even included photographs showing the markers. My message couldn't and Oppos T have been more polite. End quote. Hello, it appears the recently planted trees were installed inside my property boundary. I and Oppos VE attached the survey for reference. Please let me know when you and Oppos D like to relocate them. End quote. Simple. Professional. Problem solved. Or so I thought. A week passed. Then another. Finally, an email arrived from the HOA board president. Her name, for the sake of this story, was Karen Whitmore. And yes, she was exactly the kind of person you and Oppos reimagining. Karen and Oppos S response began pleasantly enough. She thanked me for reaching out. She thanked me for supporting community improvement efforts. She thanked me for my patience. Then she delivered the part that changed everything. The board had reviewed the situation. The trees provided value to the neighborhood. The trees improved aesthetics. The trees would eventually provide shade. The trees were unlikely to interfere with my use of the property. Therefore, The board believed leaving them where they were would be the best outcome for everyone. I read the email 3 times. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Imagine parking your car in someone else and Oppo's driveway and saying, and quote, "Well, it looks nice there, so we and Oppo's, we're going to keep it that way," end quote. That was essentially their argument. The most fascinating part wasn't Oppo's, even the trespass. It was the confidence. The board wasn't Oppo's, asking permission. They weren't Oppo's, proposing a compromise. They weren't Oppo's, offering compensation. They had simply decided that community benefit outweighed ownership. And apparently they expected me to agree. I replied once. Short and direct. I reminded them the land was privately owned. I reminded them no easement existed. I reminded them the survey was legally recorded. Then I requested removal again. A few days later, Karen answered. This time the tone was different. Less friendly. More managerial. She explained that the project had required significant volunteer effort. She explained that residents were excited about the improvements. She explained that moving the trees would be expensive. Then came the sentence that stuck with me. End quote. "We hope you and Oppo's LL choose to be a good neighbor and allow the community to enjoy the benefits of this enhancement." End quote. There it was. The real issue. Not confusion. Not a surveying error. Not a misunderstanding. They knew exactly where the trees were. They simply believed social pressure would make me surrender the land. And that and Oppo's a fascinating thing about certain people. Once they convince themselves they and Oppo's reacting for a greater good, they start believing normal rules no longer apply to them. Property rights become obstacles. Boundaries become inconveniences. Other people and Oppo's ownership becomes negotiable. I didn't and Oppo's respond. There was no point. You can't and Oppo's reason someone out of a position they didn't and Oppo's reason themselves into. Instead, I started paying closer attention. Over the next few months, I noticed residents using the trail more frequently. Parents pushing strollers, joggers, dog walkers. Sometimes I and Oppo's see people standing beside the saplings admiring them. Occasionally I and Oppo's hear comments. End quote. "These are going to look amazing in a few years." End quote. End quote. "The HOA really did a great job." End quote. End quote. "This side of the trail needed shade." End quote. Every time I heard those conversations, I had the same thought. Nobody seemed aware that the trees weren't and Oppo's actually theirs. And honestly, that wasn't and Oppo's their fault. The average resident probably assumed the board had done its homework. Most people trust authority figures within their communities. If the HOA plants trees somewhere, residents naturally assume permission was obtained. What they don't and Oppo's expect is a group of volunteers quietly landscaping somebody else and Oppo's property. Meanwhile, the saplings continued growing. Not much, just enough to establish themselves. Spring turned into summer. Summer turned into fall. And during that entire period, nobody from the HOA contacted me again. No offers. No discussions. No negotiations. The matter, as far as they were concerned, had been settled. They had made their decision. The trees were staying. What they didn't and Oppo's know was that I had made a decision too. The difference was, mine happened to be backed by property law. You see, that section of pasture had always been part of a long-term management rotation. Every few years I cleared vegetation, repositioned equipment storage, and maintained access routes along the fence line. The work wasn't and Oppo's dramatic. It was routine land management, the kind of thing rural property owners do all the time. And as autumn approached, I started reviewing those plans more carefully. Not because I was plotting revenge, at least not entirely. I simply realized something important. If the HOA insisted the trees belonged exactly where they were planted, then they were also acknowledging something else. The trees belonged to the owner of the land underneath them, and that owner was me. At the time, Karen and the HOA board probably thought the argument was over. They probably assumed enough time had passed for me to give up. Maybe they thought I wooed and Oppo's want to create conflict. Maybe they thought the optics would scare me. Maybe they believed community pressure would eventually force compliance. What they failed to understand was that patience and surrender are not the same thing. Sometimes the quietest response is simply the beginning of a much longer conversation. And by late October, that conversation was finally about to continue. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want to pause for a second because this is where a lot of HOA stories get misunderstood. People hear something like this and immediately think, and quote, well, the trees were helping everyone, so why not just leave them alone? End quote. And honestly, I understand that reaction. On the surface, it sounds reasonable. A few trees, a little shade, a nicer walking trail. What in Apos? That's the big deal. But here in Apos, that's where things get interesting. According to standard procedure, any organization, whether it and Apos, an HOA, a city contractor, a utility company, or even a landscaping crew, is supposed to verify ownership before installing improvements on land. That ISN and Apos, some technical loophole. That and Apos, the foundation of property rights. If ownership becomes optional whenever somebody believes they and Apos, re-helping the community, then boundaries stop meaning anything. From a legal perspective, the issue was never really about trees. The trees were just the physical evidence. The real issue was unauthorized use of private property. And once you look at it through that lens, the situation starts feeling very different. Now let in Apos, talk psychology for a minute. Because this is where HOA boards sometimes get themselves into trouble. This is a psychological trap. When a group invests time, money, and public praise into a project, people become emotionally attached to the outcome. Psychologists call this escalation of commitment. The more effort someone puts into a decision, the harder it becomes for them to admit they made a mistake. Instead of correcting the error, they start defending it. That and Apos, that's exactly what I suspected was happening here. The board wasn't Apos, protecting trees. They were protecting their pride. And the longer those saplings remained in the ground, the more convinced they became that the problem would eventually disappear. What they failed to consider was that the legal owner of the property hadn't Apos, changed his mind. He had simply stopped arguing. And those are two very different things. By late October, most people in Cedar Ridge had completely forgotten there had ever been a dispute. The maple saplings had survived their first growing season. Their leaves had turned bright shades of orange and red. Residents walking the trail admired them almost every day. The HOA newsletter had featured photos of the project twice. As far as the board was concerned, the matter was settled. Victory achieved. Case closed. Meanwhile, I was doing exactly what I and Apos, always done every fall. Reviewing maintenance schedules, inspecting equipment access routes, planning vegetation management work for the winter season. The section of pasture where the trees stood had been on my maintenance map for years. That wasn't Apos, something I invented afterward. It wasn't Apos, retaliation disguised as land management. The plans already existed. The difference was that this time there happened to be 15 maple trees sitting directly inside the work area. One morning I called a local forestry contractor I and Apos, worked with before. We and Apos, LL call the owner Mike. Mike was the kind of guy who could look at a property for 30 seconds and tell you where every drainage problem, fence issue, and overgrown access path was hiding. I explained what I needed. Routine clearing, fence line maintenance, vegetation removal, equipment access restoration. Nothing unusual. He asked for a map. I sent one. A day later he called back. End quote. Everything inside this boundary. End quote. End quote. Yep. End quote. End quote. Your property. End quote. End quote. County records say so. End quote. End quote. Good enough for me. End quote. That was the entire conversation. No drama. No secret planning session. No evil mastermind meeting. Just a contractor confirming ownership before doing work. You know, the thing the HOA apparently forgot to do. The crew arrived 2 weeks later. It was cold. Gray clouds hung over the fields. The kind of morning where everything feels quiet before work begins. A compact skid steer rolled off the trailer. A wood chipper followed. Then came a small utility truck carrying tools and supplies. Mike walked over holding a copy of the property map. End quote. Want to walk the boundary one more time? End quote. End quote. Absolutely. End quote. So we did. We followed every marker, every survey point, every fence segment, every corner. When we reached the row of maple trees, Mike stopped. End quote. These the famous trees? End quote. I laughed. End quote. Word gets around. End quote. End quote. Small town. End quote. He said. End quote. Everybody hears everything. End quote. He looked at the markers, looked at the trees, then looked back at me. End quote. Not much ambiguity here. End quote. End quote. Nope. End quote. End quote. Well, end quote. He said, folding the map, end quote. Let an oppos. S get to work, end quote. The first tree came out just after 9:00 and oppos clock. The process was surprisingly boring. No explosions. No dramatic chainsaw scenes. No angry music playing in the background. The crew simply removed the support stakes, loosened the root ball, lifted the sapling, and loaded it onto a trailer. Then they moved to the next one, and the next, and the next. Professional, efficient, routine, which somehow made it even funnier. Because while the HOA had spent months treating those trees like a permanent community monument, the forestry crew treated them exactly like what they legally were. Vegetation located on private property. Around 10:30, the first interesting thing happened. A woman walking her dog stopped along the trail. She stared, then stared harder. Then she approached the fence. End quote. What in oppos is happening to the trees? End quote. I smiled politely. End quote. Property maintenance. End quote. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern. End quote. But those are HOA trees. End quote. I shrugged. End quote. They and oppos, on my land. End quote. She didn't and oppos. T have an answer for that. Most people don't and oppos. T. Because ownership is one of those concepts everyone understands until it becomes inconvenient. She eventually walked away while pulling out her phone. I had a feeling several text messages were being sent. I was right. By lunchtime, news had spread through the neighborhood. Residents began appearing along sections of the trail. Some looked curious. Some looked annoyed. Some looked completely bewildered. A few were recording videos. One man actually asked if the crew had permits. Mike handed him a copy. The conversation ended immediately. Then around 1:00 and oppos clock, Karen arrived. I spotted her before she reached the work area. Fast walk, rigid posture, phone in hand. The universal body language of someone preparing to deliver an important lecture. She marched directly toward me. End quote. What is going on? End quote. Her voice carried across the field. I noticed several residents slowing down to watch. Nothing attracts attention faster than HOA drama. I stayed calm. End quote. Afternoon, Karen. End quote. End quote. What are they doing to the trees? End quote. End quote. Removing vegetation. End quote. End quote. Those trees belong to the community. End quote. I almost laughed. Because that statement perfectly summarized the entire problem. End quote. No, end quote, I said. End quote. They belong to the owner of the property where they and oppos replanted. End quote. Her face tightened. End quote. You can't end oppos. T just destroy community improvements. End quote. I looked around. The irony was incredible. Community improvements. On somebody else and oppos S land. Imagine saying that out loud and expecting it to sound reasonable. I pointed toward the survey markers. End quote. Those trees are inside my property line. End quote. End quote. We already discussed this. End quote. End quote. Yes. End quote. I replied. End quote. We did. End quote. Karen crossed her arms. End quote. The board never approved this. End quote. That one nearly got me. I had to fight back a smile. Because the board and oppos S approval wasn't oppos T exactly a legal requirement for activities occurring on property they didn't and oppos T own. End quote. I and oppos am not sure why the board would need to approve work on my land. End quote. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt much longer. Several residents nearby suddenly seemed very interested in listening. Karen realized it too. Her audience was growing, and audiences change arguments. People become less concerned with solving problems and more concerned with saving face. That and oppos S another psychological trap most conflicts fall into. Once pride enters the room, logic often leaves through the back door. Karen and oppos S tone sharpened. End quote. Those trees were planted for everyone. End quote. I nodded. End quote. I know. End quote. End quote. You could have compromised. End quote. End quote. I tried. End quote. End quote. You never worked with us. End quote. That one actually surprised me. Because the emails existed. The surveys existed. The requests existed. The documentation existed. Reality itself existed. Yet somehow I was being accused of refusing cooperation. The lesson here is that some people redefine cooperation as agreeing with them. Anything less becomes resistance. I looked directly at Karen. End quote. I asked the board to relocate them. End quote. End quote. You wanted them removed? End quote. End quote. From my property? End quote. End quote. They benefited the community? End quote. End quote. And the board could have replanted them somewhere else? End quote. No answer. Because there was an oppos. T1. The truth had been available from the beginning. The board simply chose not to act on it. Eventually Karen turned toward Mike. End quote. Can you stop this work? End quote. Mike didn't end oppos. T even hesitate. End quote. No ma and oppos. End quote. End quote. Why not? End quote. He pointed toward the survey markers. End quote. Because I work for the property owner. End quote. Simple. Professional. Devastating. Karen stood there for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone and walked away. I assumed she was calling other board members. Maybe an attorney. Maybe both. Either way, the work continued. By mid-afternoon, every maple tree was gone. The support stakes were gone. The irrigation bags were gone. The mulch was gone. The area was graded smooth and clean. If somebody had visited for the first time that day, they never would have known the trees had existed. And that and oppos. When the strangest part happened. Nothing. No police. No lawsuit. No emergency board meeting. No legal threats. No cease and desist letters. Just silence. The reason was simple. The board and oppos' position sounded powerful in newsletters. It sounded powerful during meetings. It sounded powerful when speaking to residents who assumed authority automatically created ownership. But authority has limits. Property records Don and oppos. Care about popularity. Survey markers Don and oppos. Care about community votes. County maps Don and oppos. Care about HOA opinions. Reality remains reality. A week later, another neighborhood newsletter appeared. I almost couldn't and oppos. Wait to read it. The language was fascinating. According to the update, end quote, certain landscaping features located near the community boundary were unexpectedly removed during private property maintenance activities. End quote. Unexpectedly. That word did a lot of heavy lifting. Because there was nothing unexpected about it. The board had received surveys. The board had received notices. The board had received opportunities to fix the problem. What actually happened was entirely predictable. They simply didn't and oppos. Expect consequences. The article went on to express disappointment while reaffirming the HOA and oppos' commitment to future beautification projects. Notice what was missing. No accusation. No demand. No claim of ownership. No threat of legal action. Just disappointment, which is often what remains after entitlement collides with reality. Over the following months, the subject slowly faded away. The trail remained open. Residents continued using it. Life moved on. Every now and then I and oppos. See someone glance toward the stretch of grass where the trees once stood. Most people eventually learned what happened. And once they understood the actual property boundaries, their reactions changed. Not everyone agreed with my decision. Some thought I should have left the trees alone. Some thought the board should have moved them. Others believed the entire dispute was unnecessary. Fair enough. People are allowed different opinions. What nobody successfully argued, however, was that the HOA had the right to use land it didn't and oppos own, because that argument falls apart the second you apply it consistently. If private ownership matters, then it matters. Even when the project looks nice. Even when the intentions are good. Even when removing the improvement feels wasteful. Especially then. Because rights that only exist when convenient aren't and oppos really rights at all. And somewhere inside that lesson sat 15 maple trees that never got the chance to become the community landmark the HOA imagined. Not because anyone hated trees. Not because anyone opposed shade. But because someone confused access with ownership. And by the time they realized the difference, the forestry crew had already packed up and gone home. After all was said and done, I found myself standing at the edge of that back pasture, looking at the open grass where the maple saplings used to stand, and feeling an odd mix of satisfaction and reflection. It wasn't about revenge, at least not the way people usually think of it. It was about clarity, about boundaries, about reminding everyone, including myself, that good intentions, while noble, don't automatically overwrite reality. That's the first lesson. Good intentions are not ownership. They don't change the fact that property law exists, that surveys exist, and that someone owns the land beneath the soil, the grass, and yes, even the trees. From a legal perspective, It's actually really simple. Ownership is tied to the ground, not the aesthetic value of improvements. Those maples were lovely. They could have been a centerpiece of a walking trail for decades, but they didn't magically become communal property just because a volunteer crew planted them, and the HOA newsletter made everyone feel warm and fuzzy inside. And from a psychological angle, this story is a perfect demonstration of what I like to call the community entitlement trap. Once people invest time, energy, and pride into a project, they start seeing their effort as justification for control, even if that control legally belongs to someone else. That's why Karen Whitmore and the HOA board were so confident the trees could stay. They weren't just defending a planting project. They were defending themselves, their volunteer hours, their perceived authority. And this is exactly why escalation of commitment is so powerful and dangerous. People rarely step back voluntarily once pride and public perception get involved. They double down, often at the expense of reality. The second lesson is about patience and timing. I didn't respond aggressively at first. I didn't show anger. I didn't take the dramatic confrontational route. I simply let the situation develop, kept my record straight, and waited for the appropriate time to act. And when that time came, my actions weren't out of spite. They were procedural, routine land management, standard property maintenance. But the optics? Devastating for the board. The payoff was almost cinematic. A quiet, professional crew, a clear survey map, 15 maple saplings removed with zero drama, leaving the HOA to explain in their newsletter that landscaping features unexpectedly disappeared. Unexpected, yes, but only if you ignore surveys, legal boundaries, and a history of polite warnings. The third lesson is about communication, or rather, the limits of it. I had emails, photos, surveys, polite requests, all documented and ready. And still, the HOA tried to redefine cooperation as agreement with them. From a social psychology standpoint, this is fascinating. People assume that authority and consensus give them de facto rights. But authority has limits, and consensus does not create ownership. This is the trap most homeowners associations fall into. They equate community pride and collective action with legal entitlement. And finally, the takeaway for anyone watching this, whether you're a property owner, a neighbor, or even part of a volunteer board, is simple but profound. Respect boundaries, confirm ownership before planting anything, and recognize that intentions do not override rights. The lesson here is, the soil you stand on matters more than the aesthetics you imagine on it. Improvements planted without permission are temporary, no matter how good they look in a newsletter photo. And if you ever find yourself in a similar position, either as a property owner or part of a community project, remember the story of the maple saplings. Document your boundaries, communicate clearly, and never assume goodwill can substitute for legal reality. As for me, I still enjoy that back pasture. It's open, clean, and entirely mine. The trail beside it is still used, residents still walk and jog, and no one has suggested planting trees again. The HOA has learned a subtle lesson. Community initiatives are better when they respect property lines. And if nothing else, I've got a story that combines rural patience, legal clarity, and a touch of poetic justice. So here's my question for you. What would you have done in my place? Would you have quietly let the HOA keep those trees, or would you have acted the way I did? Do you think the board should have verified ownership before planting, or are they justified because their intentions were good? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because honestly, this story sparks debates about property, psychology, and power every time. And if you've ever seen something similar happen in your neighborhood, whether it's plants, fences, or any community improvement gone wrong, I'd love to hear about it. Because stories like this remind us that boundaries, legal, personal, and social, exist for a reason, and respecting them is sometimes the most radical act of all. Finally, don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories that explore the strange intersection of neighborhood politics, property law, and human nature. Because believe me, Cedar Ridge Estates is not the only place where a good deed goes hilariously wrong.